Patricia Poleo arrived in Caracas expecting to document a failed state. The international media had painted Venezuela as socialism's inevitable collapse. But as her taxi wound through the city's streets, she noticed something the outside world had missed entirely. The story everyone was telling about Venezuela wasn't just incomplete, it was fundamentally backwards. Contrary to popular belief, the crisis in Venezuela reveals more about how the world constructs narratives of failure than about the country itself. This is not a story about socialism versus capitalism. This is a story about how an entire planet learned to read a nation through the lens of its own assumptions. The resource curse myth. For decades, economists explained Venezuela's troubles through the resource curse theory. The logic seemed bulletproof. Countries rich in oil become economically distorted and ultimately impoverished by their own wealth. Norway thrived because it managed oil responsibly. Venezuela collapsed because it squandered resources on populist giveaways. But this explanation tells us more about the observers than the observed. Consider this paradox. Venezuela has been oil-dependent for over a century. For most of that time, from the 1920s through the 1990s, it was Latin America's wealthiest democracy. Oil didn't curse Venezuela during those decades. It built hospitals, universities, and a substantial middle class. The real story begins with the collapse of an entire social contract in the 1980s, when oil prices crashed and Venezuela implemented IMF-mandated austerity. Poverty rates doubled. Traditional political parties lost legitimacy, not because oil corrupted them, but because they could no longer deliver on their promises. This opened space for Hugo Chávez's radical alternative. What the outside world reads as economic irrationality was actually rational response to institutional breakdown. When your currency becomes worthless and your political system unresponsive, you create parallel systems. The resource curse narrative misses this because it assumes countries should develop according to a universal template. The hyperinflation laboratory nothing captures the world's incomprehension quite like its reaction to Venezuelan hyperinflation. Western economists describe it as pure catastrophe, the inevitable result of reckless money printing. But this reveals profound misunderstanding of how societies adapt to monetary collapse. Patricia Poleo discovered this during her extended stays. Yes, the official economy had ceased functioning. The bolivar had become worthless. Goods had disappeared from shelves. But alongside this collapse, something remarkable emerged. A parallel economy of extraordinary sophistication. Venezuelans had essentially reinvented money. They created networks of barter and credit functioning without currency. They developed early warning systems for product availability through WhatsApp. They established informal exchange rates, more accurate than official data. They learned to convert between multiple currencies with professional expertise. Most remarkably, they maintained social institutions that held communities together. Schools operated though teachers earned nothing. Hospitals provided care though lacking supplies. The fabric of society bent under tremendous pressure, but didn't break completely. The outside world interpreted this as evidence of failure. But from another perspective, it represented extraordinary innovation under impossible circumstances. Venezuelans had created a functioning economy within a non-functioning state, requiring tremendous social cohesion and creativity. The democracy paradox. Perhaps nowhere is the misreading more complete than in discussions of Venezuelan democracy. International consensus is clear. Chavez and Maduro destroyed democracy through authoritarian overreach. This narrative shapes every other interpretation of Venezuelan politics, but this obscures a deeper paradox. By many measures, Venezuela under Chavez was more democratic than ever. Voter turnout increased dramatically. Previously marginalized populations gained representation. The government held more elections than any previous administration. International observers initially praised electoral transparency. The shift in perception coincided not with changes in electoral practices, but with electoral outcomes. When Chavez began winning convincingly and implementing policies challenging Western orthodoxy, the same observers who certified elections began questioning their legitimacy. This reveals something troubling about how democracy is measured internationally. Emphasis falls not on procedural fairness, but on outcomes aligning with Western preferences. A democracy consistently electing leaders who challenge the global order becomes, by definition, a democracy in crisis. The migration misunderstanding, the exodus of millions, became the most visible symbol of crisis. International media presents this as pure desperation, people fleeing socialist disaster. But migration patterns tell a more complex story. The largest movements weren't random flights from poverty, but strategic relocations within established networks of family and opportunity. Many migrants weren't the poorest Venezuelans, but middle-class members with resources to relocate. Moreover, Venezuelan migration resembles other regional movements, from Mexico northward, from rural to urban areas. These are driven not simply by crisis, but by differential opportunities and social networks making relocation possible. The uniqueness lies not in motivations, but political interpretation. While other migrations are understood as economic phenomena, Venezuelan migration is framed as political persecution. This serves receiving countries' interests, presenting responses as humanitarian rather than economic. The sanctions experiment, the most revealing aspect, has been using economic sanctions as political change tools. Beginning in 2017, these represented one of history's most comprehensive isolation regimes, targeting entire economic sectors. The logic seems straightforward. Economic pressure would force political change by making government unable to function. This assumed Venezuelans would blame their government rather than international actors, and collapse would automatically translate into transformation. Results contradicted every assumption. Rather than weakening government, sanctions strengthened it by eliminating alternative power centers. Rather than promoting opposition unity, they created new conflicts. Rather than generating uprising, they produced migration, reducing domestic pressure while generating international sympathy. Sanctions forced Venezuela to develop relationships with countries willing to ignore international pressure. China, Russia, Iran stepped into spaces vacated by Western entities. These relationships were less favorable, but provided sufficient resources to maintain function. It's the alternative. Reading contrary to everything the world believes, Venezuela's experience represents not failure of alternative development, but violent resistance any serious challenge to global economic order inevitably provokes. Venezuela's crime wasn't economic incompetence or authoritarianism. Its crime was demonstrating that a relatively small, oil-rich nation could redistribute wealth, challenge multinationals, and build diplomatic relationships, prioritizing South-South cooperation over dependence. For a brief period under Chavez, Venezuela showed alternatives to Washington consensus development might exist. This demonstration effect terrified international observers who'd spent decades arguing no alternative existed. Venezuela's successes, dramatic poverty reductions, healthcare improvements, increased political participation had to be discredited before inspiring similar experiments. The sustained campaign to delegitimize Venezuela's system wasn't response to failures, but to successes. The message was clear. Countries attempting independent courses face full international pressure until capitulation or collapse, breaking the mirror. The misreading isn't accidental or from insufficient information. It's the inevitable product of a global system intolerant of serious challenges to fundamental assumptions about societal organization. Venezuela's experience suggests the choice facing developing countries isn't between good and bad governance, but between compliance with international expectations and defiance consequences. Countries accepting assigned roles receive investment and positive coverage. Those attempting independence face isolation and delegitimization. But narratives disconnected from reality eventually collapse under their contradictions. The Venezuelan story becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as evidence accumulates of adaptation rather than collapse, retained popular support despite hardship, and innovations that might teach the world. Venezuela isn't a failed state or socialist disaster. It's a society forced to reinvent itself under extraordinary pressure, doing so with remarkable creativity and resilience. The failure isn't Venezuelan, it's ours, for choosing comfortable narratives over uncomfortable truths, seeing expectations rather than reality. The real story continues, being written in communities and networks, sustaining Venezuelan society through crisis. Until we learn to see clearly, we'll misunderstand broader transformations reshaping the global system.